Hello there, welcome to Planet America's Off the Planet with all the extra bits, bonus stories and interviews we didn't have time to put on the air. Not to be confused with Planet America's Planet America, which is the show that you will find elsewhere on iView and other channels as well. So
or to be confused with a pep podcast, which you find all your favourite podcast places.
That's right, that's the stuff that didn't even make it into Off the Planet.
That's right.
Well, Chaz, this week, I guess we should get to the possible nuclear conflagration and the end of humanity as we know it first, because if it happens, then there's no need to talk about the rest of the stuff.
That's true, that's true. Before the world ends, we should talk about the potential end of the world.
Yeah, so Joe Biden used the word Armageddon in a address that he gave to some wealthy donors this week, talking about it, essentially saying that, we are at our greatest peril now than we have been in 60 years since the Cuban Missile Crisis.
I've got some of the quotes here for you, John.
First
time since the Cuban Missile Crisis we've had a direct threat of the use of a nuclear weapon if in fact things continue down the path they're going. I don't think there's any such thing as the ability to easily use a tactical nuclear weapon, that's what Putin's threatened, and not end up with Armageddon. I'm trying to figure out what is Putin's off-ramp. Where does he find a way out? Where does he find himself in a position that he does not only lose face, but lose significant power within Russia? So there's some interesting thoughts from Joe Biden.
So what he's essentially saying is that if Putin uses one of these small so-called tactical nuclear weapons, so not necessarily something that is designed to blow up a whole city like Nagasaki or Hiroshima type bombs, but we're talking about something that might blow up a barracks or a power station.
2 or 3 blocks, basically.
Right, so much smaller devices. But Biden what he's saying there is really important, because he's saying it will lead to Armageddon, as in, once you let that genie out of the bottle with a small nuke, it escalates.
Yeah.
So even if America is looking at a conventional response, maybe NATO air raids on Russian military targets within Ukraine, he still sees it as, and they've war gamed this during the Obama years in particular, and they said basically, nah, it's like a row of dominoes. Once one goes off, then suddenly we're in this death spiral.
Yeah, so it's not a threat. It's an expression of concern, right? Okay, so I suppose the first question we should ask is, should Biden be saying any of this at all?
Well, you would think that to start talking about Armageddon, as with anything Joe Biden says, particularly these things like, about Taiwan status and everything else, you think, one, is Joe Biden actually sending a very nuanced and important foreign policy warning to an adversary, back off or else? Or is Joe Biden, being the gaffe-prone Joe Biden that we've known for the last 50 years in American public life, where he says things, sometimes behind closed doors like this, where the language is not as carefully calibrated as it should be for somebody who's now President of the United States?
I will say this, I don't think Joe Biden chooses his words particularly well generally, but I think he's pretty good at not going into areas he shouldn't be going into. Like Taiwan is probably the only exception of that, but I get the feeling that he did that on purpose with Taiwan. He was actually trying to reset. He kept on doing it over and over again. I feel like generally, this nuclear weapons is not something he just mouths off about normally. So I don't think this was an accident. Personally speaking, I think it actually was quite intentional. I think the fact he did it in a fundraiser was also intentional. He didn't hold a press conference about it. He didn't want to make it a big thing, but I think he's just trying to send a message to Putin. That's my thought.
Yeah.
And I think it's a good message, because I think what we've seen in the last few months is Putin trying to normalise the idea of tactical nuclear weapons. He keeps on bringing it up over and over again. It's such a taboo, the idea of nuclear weapons. I think that Putin is probably trying to read his mind here, is trying to soften people up for small nuclear weapons rather than trying to make a distinction between the tactical nukes and the big nukes. I think Biden is saying, no. Any nuke leads us down the path. So let's not do that. I think that's an important message for him to send.
Yeah, and presumably, we don't know what Putin is thinking. We don't know why he invaded Ukraine in the first place when his military was clearly not up to the task. And the scenario that America seems to be preparing for is, as you suggest, a limited use of a device, probably in one of the 4 provinces of eastern Ukraine that Russia has now formally annexed and, as far as their legalities are concerned, incorporated into the Russian Federation, even though that is not recognised by Ukraine or the rest of the world. So the idea is that Russia might say, well, okay, you pull out of eastern Ukraine or these new Russian territories, or we will use these weapons. So there's blackmail involved. Not that they're going to wipe Kiev off the map with a much larger device. But when Biden is talking about how this ultimately leads us to a situation such as the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, where both sides feel as though they've locked themselves into a requirement to initiate out of fear and then retaliate out of concern that if they don't, they'll be seen as being weak. America needs to try and balance what is its limited option. Are there any limits? And he's essentially saying, once you go nuclear, we go nuclear as well. But of course, Ukraine or the eastern provinces are not part of NATO. There's not a requirement for America to defend Ukraine under NATO or anything. So it's going to be really interesting to see what they do.
I think it is important that nuclear is one of the very few bright lines left in world politics. There's an ongoing slippery slope going in every direction, except for nuclear. And I think it's important to keep that bright line because you don't want to risk a slippery slope in that particular region.
Yeah, although for Vladimir Putin, if he's in danger of losing a conventional war, which would have massive political implications for him at home at the end of his career, instead he can say, well, you know what, this is kind of a hostage situation, back off, or we drop the bomb. Maybe he's going to be tempted to do it.
Which is presumably why he keeps on intimating it, because their army is not much chop. It's certainly less chop than we thought it was.
Yeah.
And and nuclear weapons might be their only option if they want to win somewhere down the track. But I was going to say that I think also another good thing about this is, I mean, I don't think it was a perfect message, but I do think that it also showed a certain amount of respect for Putin, like saying you should believe him, you should trust him. And because I think Putin, at least he acts like he's feeling disrespected in the last little while. So I think that's a good thing. I think also the off-ramp talk, I think is good talk because I don't know what the off-ramp is either. But what this does is invite back-channel communications with Russia. Tell us what the off-ramp is for you guys.
Yeah. I was interested over the weekend after it appears Ukrainian special forces attacked the bridge linking Crimea, which is formerly a part of Ukraine, but annexed by Russia in 2014, the bridge linking that back to mainland Russia. After that was attacked, Putin started using interesting language referring not to Ukrainians or to special forces, but terrorists. That's interesting, because if he starts to use a separate category for Ukrainians to say these people are terrorists, we're getting back to the kind of language that was being used in some of the atrocities were committed in Chechnya 20 years ago. So whether he would consider, well, we're not using a tactical nuclear weapon against Ukraine or Ukrainian targets, we're using them against terrorists within Russia's federation, the erstwhile Eastern Ukraine. So there could be something to be read into that language.
Yeah, he does enjoy talking about terrorism and Nazis as well with Ukraine. He enjoys using both. The last thing I'd say about this is that as far as off-ramps go, it's not just Russia that needs an off-ramp. It's actually Ukraine that needs an off-ramp as well, because they're talking real tough for a side that's been propped up by America. Like in that they are like Zelensky's basically ruled out the possibility of stopping until they take all their territory back, including Crimea, which is a very complicated area. Zelensky this week specifically said, in fact, it was to an Australian, it's the Lowy Institute, to the Australians, he said in an interview that he thought America should take preventative strikes to stop Russia engaging with nuclear weapons. And you go, well, what are you doing? You're just going to escalate. Now, they did clarify, the Foreign Secretary did clarify, it might be a language issue, that he didn't mean nuclear strikes, he meant like sanctions or whatever. But still, like, the Ukrainians are pushing hard and they're doing a lot of, they do a lot of crowing, let's put it this way. Like when that bridge blew up that you described, there was a lot of boasting going on from the Ukrainian government and so forth. And I feel like America needs to show Russia that they're in charge of Ukraine as well. Like because if Russia doesn't trust that Ukraine won't stop if Russia tries to go down an off-ramp, then they're not going to go down an off-ramp. They'll just keep on fighting. I mean, and this needs to end somehow. Like we need to think about how this is going to end down the track, because it's not going to end with a humiliating defeat of Putin without him doing something radical at some point in time. So if we want to avoid something radical, we should work out a way of America should work out a way of negotiating some kind of deal which is actually acceptable.
Yes, or at least something that drags on for many, many decades, at which point Putin will no longer be a problem.
Before we talk about Herschel Walker, can I just say one thing that's unrelated to this, which is visitor logs? Because where Biden was going after this speech was off to his holiday house, right? And a lot of people are saying, he's going on holiday when Armageddon's happening. No, he's going back to work in his holiday house, but he spends a quarter of his life in Delaware. Visitor logs. One of the first things he did when he became president was to say no visitor logs when I'm in Delaware. A quarter of the time, we don't know who he sees. He, of course, is at work when he's at Delaware. When Trump did this with Mar-a-Lago, the press had an absolute conniption. Biden shouldn't be doing this. We should know who he is. He's on call all the time. We should know who he's seen, when he's seen them. If it happens in the White House, we know. So why wouldn't we know who he's talking to when he's in Delaware? I know it's not strictly related to this. Well, it's a real annoyance.
Well, but it relates to our next story about Herschel Walker in Georgia, because once standards and expectations and norms are eroded, the next person's not going to go back and say, well, I have to hold myself to a higher standard than the previous guy who got away with it without any consequences. It might be quite handy for me to be very secretive, you know. So, look, in the case of Herschel Walker, there's quite a lot to say about that and about the state of politics generally in Georgia. But first, to get a bit more background, we had a nice chat on Planet America with Tia Mitchell from the Atlanta Journal-Constitutional newspaper, who covers Georgia politics for them. And we wanted to know a bit about Walker and a bit about voting trends broadly and what this might mean, etc. So here's a bit more of Tia Mitchell. So can you give us a bit of a sense just as to how big a name Herschel Walker is in the United States and specifically there in Georgia?
So I would say if you talk about the United States as a whole, Herschel Walker is a sports figure among many famous sports figures in America. A former NFL player who played for the Dallas Cowboys, pretty well-known sports figure, but not like superstar status. But when it comes to the state of Georgia, Herschel Walker is one of the most famous Georgians, and he's arguably, the most famous native Georgian when it comes to sports figures. So born and raised in Georgia, went to the University of Georgia, the flagship university there, led them to their first national football championship in a state that is very serious about its football. So in the state of Georgia, he is a superstar. He's the most famous athlete to come out of Georgia. He's somebody who has been heralded as a hero for the state. So that's why, particularly in Georgia, his athletic celebrity has really helped fuel his campaign for Senate.
Tia, does it matter at all that until very recently Herschel Walker didn't live in Georgia? He lived in Texas, or does that not matter?
So again, for Georgia, it doesn't matter as much because they consider him a native son. And he did always keep ties to Georgia. He would visit the small town where he was born and raised. He had a house there where, he bought for his mom, for example. So in a lot of ways, even though he has not lived in Georgia for quite a long time until he decided to run for Senate, again, that celebrity status he enjoyed never went away, because for him, he was a local hero born and raised in Georgia who had gone on to do these great things for sports.
Tia, a lot of this stuff would seem to be the kind of thing that would come out either in a background check from a candidate's own campaign, or the vetting that gets done, or by their primary rival. So why is it all coming out so late in the election campaign?
Well, I think there are people who did that vetting and, again, had inklings of some of these things. But at the end of the day, once he became a candidate, there was no stopping him. There were people who tried to talk Herschel Walker out of running for Senate. There were people who, are in Republican leadership who said, hey, don't let this guy run. But Herschel Walker, with the support of Donald Trump, decided to move forward. And in that way, you can't stop someone in America from running for office. It's very easy to run for office in America, actually. And when it became a primary, he won very easily. So I think some of those people who, again, maybe knew some of these things or were a little bit concerned, kept their mouth shut, because it became very clear that Herschel Walker was going to be our guy. And, you know, they, even more than they want a good candidate, they want a winning candidate. They want to win back control of the U.S. Senate. They really need to win back this seat in Georgia for Republicans to retake the majority in the Senate. And again, it became very clear early on that Herschel Walker was going to be the Republican candidate. So even people who may have concerns about him, it did not behoove them politically to expose him or to try to curtail that campaign, because again, he's their nominee. It became very clear. And for many Republicans, the ends justify the means. They want the majority. It doesn't really matter much who helps them get the majority, just the fact that they want the majority.
Now, there's been some indication in the polls that Biden has struggled to build enthusiasm amongst black voters and amongst young voters in particular. Both those groups were pivotal to the 2020 Georgia vote. So how are you evaluating enthusiasm on the ground at the moment for Democrats?
Yeah, so some polling, including polling by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, has shown that there is some support that's shifting away from the Democratic Party towards the Republican Party in certain races when it comes to Black voters. More pronounced in our governor's race, which is between incumbent Governor Brian Kemp, who's a Republican, and Stacey Abrams, a Democrat, which is a rematch from 4 years ago. And some of this has to do with the power of the incumbency. You know, Black voters are like any other voter, which means that it's hard to unseat an incumbent. And there's always going to be people who say, you know, my life is doing okay, so I'm okay with whoever's currently in the job right now. It just so happens that person in the job right now is a Republican. I still think, well, we know that the vast majority of Black voters are still going to support the Democrat. The vast majority of young voters are still going to support the Democrat on the ballot, whether it's for governor or for Senate, but it still is going to come down to turnout. What Democrats don't want is those voters to stay home and say, you know what, I'm not enthusiastic about the Democrats on the ballot, so I just won't bother showing up to vote. Recently, President Biden announced that he is pardoning people who were facing federal charges of possession of small amounts of marijuana. Those are the type of things that can help invigorate voters of color, young voters, because those are an issue that they know that people of color are more likely to face charges for low-level drug offenses. The same thing with the student loan relief. That's something that progressives, which is mostly your people of color, your younger voters, have been asking for, because again, carrying large amounts of student debt is something that voters of color affects voters of color more. So I think the White House, Democrats in power, have tried to do things to invigorate their base and give them a reason to show up and support the Democrats on the ballot. We'll see if that plays out on Election Day.
So really useful there, Chaz, to get a sense of who exactly Herschel Walker is, and this sense that, you know, he's hanging tough and it's still a very competitive race. And apart from anything else, there's nothing they can do about it now because they're about to start voting in the next week or two.
Yeah. So how do you think Herschel Walker's? I mean, obviously, like Tia said, he's taken the Trump playbook and he's run with it. Do you think that's the right playbook for this particular scandal?
It's the only possible playbook. There is no explanation. So he has to deny, he has to not engage with the specifics of the issue. He has to, you know, in the same way as Trump, after his initial was pinged with the Access Hollywood tape, you recall, the grab him by the pussy tape, within a couple of months, he was saying that was doctored. That was made up. He essentially rewrote history and said, I never said that, I never did that. It was all political, forget about it, the whole thing. So Herschel Walker, yes, taking a leaf out of Trump's book, it's his only option right now. The only question is the level to which Republicans, conservatives who are against abortion, a lot of them, although, you know, 50% of Republicans by some polls are not against abortion in all cases, as to whether it just demotivates his supporters enough to stay at home and give Warnock a victory. Okay,
now we'll definitely have to talk about that in a second, but just going back a little bit, I actually disagree with you that this is the only play that he's got.
What else?
I think it's a different play because I don't think he is Trump. Trump is aggressive. Trump likes to fight. Etc. Herschel Walker is not that person. Herschel Walker is a friendly, warm character. That is that's what the way he's been presenting himself.
A friendly, warm character who is accused of bashing up his wife, holding a gun at her head, and playing Russian roulette with himself.
I know, but this is the thing. He's got this sordid past, this horrible past. He has not denied any of that past, right, until now. Right? His whole campaign is, I used to have mental health issues. I used to have all these problems. I overcame it through religion. Yeah. Look at me now. I'm a new man. I'm like a saint now as compared to what I used to be like. This fits right in there. He can say this is part of... He can admit it. He could. Now he can't. But he could have just said, you know what, that was true. That was true. That was part of my sordid past. When I was off the rails, when I was playing Russian roulette, when I was threatening my wife, I was doing that kind of thing as well. But I've discovered Jesus, and I'm not like this anymore.
It's one thing to draw a line under something that you did or said in 1992, which is the case of some of the things that he's accused of. But in the case of the second attempted abortion, which apparently didn't happen and is now one of his 4 children born out of wedlock. That was only 2011. That's pretty recent to have had a come to Jesus moment since then, and to say, I'm an entirely different character.
11 years.
Now. Yeah.
I mean, look, and I should say, that line of I was a different person then is kind of rubbish, because a lot of the things that happened after his book came out about his mental health, overcoming his mental health demons. Yeah. That was 2008 that book came out, right? Okay, so it is kind of rubbish, but that's what he's been getting away with. So I don't know why he couldn't... I think it's an odd decision to move away from that now.
So there's a redemption story that
he's just messed up by blatantly lying, in my view.
And yet he's known that all this stuff was out there and could well have come out. So it would seem as though this is not just they missed a moment, a spur-of-the-moment decision. They've had time to strategise. What do we do when this stuff comes out? Deny everything with what they decided on, presumably a year or more ago.
And they've also began attacking the woman a little bit, which is obviously the reason that she wanted to be anonymous. She knew this was coming. They've started leaking text messages that she sent to his wife, including text messages saying, when he was running in the primary, he'll be great and you'll keep him focused. Proud of you guys and wishing nothing but the best for you tonight. And Herschel Walker has now said that she's been angry at me for years and it's very difficult. She's a big, big advocate for abortion rights. She said that. And they also said she's a Democrat, indicating this is political. But then why'd she send positive texts if this is all, she's got an axe to grind and she's a Democrat? Anyway, it doesn't make any sense, but they're starting to attack her. And also they're starting to attack Warnock as well. So even though Warnock's got nothing to do with this at all, they're saying this is the Trump strategy. Go, how about him? How about him? Like Trump did with Clinton in 2016 after the pussy tape thing. They're now saying that the number of times I've heard a Republican say in the last couple of days, he ran over his wife, or domestic violence allegations. The guy, even according to her, she says that he ran over her foot from a stationary position. So it can't have been going too fast. And it was on police tape. It was on tape, right? And he didn't get charged, right? And the hospital said there was...
They looked at it and they said there's no obvious injury here, no charges.
I'm not excusing what Warnock did at all, right? What I'm saying is it's not running over your wife, which is what they keep on saying. He ran over his wife. As Herschel did this, but anyway, so it's ugly. Okay, so let's talk about the Republican thing, whether Republicans can swallow hard and vote for him. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I mean... What's really interesting about this is that it's not just Republicans, but it is specifically Trump Republicans who are running to Herschel Walker's defence now. The Trump Super PAC, MAGA PAC, just injected $750,000 into the Walker campaign this week to pay for ads defending him right now. And this is important for Trump because Georgia, remember, also on the ballot this November is Brian Kemp, the Republican governor of Georgia, who was not endorsed by Donald Trump, who pushed back against Donald Trump's claims of election rigging in 2020 and 2021. Brian Kemp is now running about 5 points ahead of Stacey Abrams, the Democrat. Brian Kemp looks like he's going to get returned as Republican governor of Georgia as an anti-Trump Republican governor of Georgia. So Trump really needs Herschel Walker, his hand-picked candidate, to win. Otherwise, there is a very, very clear distinction of what the anti-Trump Republican and the pro-Trump Republican are appealing to voters right now. So Trump's not just about, Trump probably doesn't really care whether the Republicans get control of the Senate or not. This is all about Trump's control of the Republican Party. So there's a lot at stake for him. For Republicans, of course, just a lot of Conservatives. Look, we don't like Herschel Walker. We didn't want him to be our candidate, but a little bit like Trump in 2016 and 2020, we're sucking him up because power is more important.
Yeah, the Senate might ride on this race. It really might. So do you think there's anything wrong with that? I mean, I've seen a lot of Democrats accusing them of horrendous hypocrisy and saying, oh, they've got no morals or whatever. Do you have a problem with the Republicans voting for Herschel Walker, even though he's done all this?
Well, I don't have a problem with it. It's not really my place to have a problem with it or not. It's just emblematic to me as to how profoundly partisan voters on both sides have become in the United States, that they will overlook the shortcomings of their side and justify that because, well, at least they're not as bad as that other party. And the people that we've seen, including Republicans this week, being talked to by the news media saying, well, I don't know that I could vote for Herschel Walker but after this, but I'm definitely not voting for Raphael Warnock because, you know, he's a liberal and he's in favour of abortion. Herschel Walker is against abortion and he says that he didn't do it anyway. So you believe what you want to believe. It's the indoctrination, it's the deeply rooted partisanship that has made hypocrites of all of us these days, particularly in the United States, where we just have this blind spot and we just go, well, I don't care. Ultimately, I don't care because they're bad people and I'm going to support my team. To
me, the denial of the facts annoys me, and the suggestion that he's some kind of Christian warrior and whatever, like that, that annoys me. That annoys me, but the idea of a Republican just saying, you know what, the guy's a bit of a scumbag, but I'm going to vote for him anyway.
Yeah.
I got no problem with that at all. In fact, if I was a Republican, I would. I absolutely would, because you just think to yourself, if he's just auditioning to be a rubber stamp for Republicans, right? To give Republicans the Senate. That's what he's auditioning for. It doesn't matter whether he's got high morals, when he's just voting yes when he's meant to vote yes and vote no when he's meant to vote no. That's how politics works. If you want to see, if you just think about the broader scheme of all the different things that would happen versus a Republican House, a Republican Senate and a Democratic Senate, it's night and day. It's completely different. I think it's completely reasonable to vote. Like if you look at Cal Cunningham, the Democrat in North Carolina in 2020, like he had a sex scandal going into the election, right? He was miles ahead of the Republican when the sex scandal broke in October. Over the last 25 public polls, he led in 22 of them and tied in 2. He ended up losing by 95,000 votes, right? He was 115,000 votes short of Biden and 265,000 votes short of the North Carolina Democrat running for governor. So there's a pretty good chance that 115 to 120,000 Democrats stayed home or just didn't vote for Cal Cunningham when they voted for Joe Biden.
Yet it's Conservatives that are meant to be the sort of morally judgmental ones. Not Democrats.
I'm not calling morals. I'm just saying I wonder how many of those Democrats now wish they had a 51-49 Senate.
Yeah, of course.
The world would be very different if the Democrats had a 51-49
We're running short on
Senate.
time. You've got some malarkey for us.
Yes, it's just on this very, very quickly. For those who have been on the internet during this Herschel Walker story, you would have undoubtedly seen this clip from Newt Gingrich.
I talked to Herschel about this morning, and I've known Herschel a good while. I think he's a remarkable person. I think he's the most important Senate candidate in the country because he'll do more to change the Senate just by the sheer presence, by his confidence, by his deep commitment to Christ, by the degree to which he is, he's been through a long, tough period. He had a lot of concussions coming out of football. He suffered PTSD.
Okay, and you see how it's cut halfway through a sentence? Whenever you see a cut halfway through a sentence, go find the original. Because right away, there are lots of headlines on the back of this. I've got one here from Rolling Stone. Newt Gingrich defends Herschel Walker. He had a lot of concussions. There's a lot of this. There's a lot of this. Oh, he's just doing it because he had concussions thing. Right? I went back, found the original clip. Here it is.
I talked to Herschel about this morning, and I've known Herschel a good while. I think he's a remarkable person. I think he's the most important Senate candidate in the country because he'll do more to change the Senate just by the sheer presence, by his confidence, by his deep commitment to Christ, by the degree to which he is, he's been through a long, tough period. He had a lot of concussions coming out of football. He suffered PTSD. He's given over 480 speeches on military bases around the world, teaching our young soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines that you can recover, you can have a better future. He and his ex-wife have admitted they had difficult times, and I think the most vicious thing that Warnock has done, the most inexcusable thing, is he took a quote from Herschel's ex-wife where she said, yes, it's true that we were out of control and that Herschel pulled a gun on me. And then he cuts off the whole next section where she says, and you know, that was the bottom point, and we found Jesus Christ, and our lives began to improve. And by the way, Walker's sitting next to her during this interview, and the Warnock team deliberately edited this thing, totally used her in a despicable way. I think she has a lawsuit if she wants it. And it just tells you the total lack of morality is for a preacher to deliberately cut up an interview which is in praise of Christ. Tells you a lot about how shallow and hypocritical and dishonest Warnock is.
So what you can see there is that Newt Gingrich was actually saying he's had a lot of concussions, he had PTSD. This is part of the adversity that he went through and then overcame through religion, which is why he's such an inspiration, why he should be in the Senate. That's the angle that he was running with, not you excuse everything he did. He was funny in the head because he had concussions. That's not what he was saying, but that's what everyone said he was saying. And I just want to bring that to people's attention because, yeah, everyone, both sides take the other side out of context on Twitter. When you see a clip cut off halfway through a sentence, find the original, please. So that's what I'll say about that.
Now, we'll talk a little bit about particularly the political risks, but also the sort of diplomatic challenges being posed by the increasing oil prices in the United States and Biden's not really successful outreach to Saudi Arabia.
No, it has not worked for him at all. And there's a real question at the moment about what he can do at all. What are his options? Because Saudi Arabia have got him over a barrel, so to speak. I didn't mean to do that on purpose. What conservatives are saying is that actually the fault is not, the issue is not about Saudi Arabia. The issue is about the fact that Biden has cracked down on drilling in America. That's what they're saying. They're saying that with Trump, America was independent and they didn't have to care about Saudi Arabia. Okay, I just want to just explain just very quickly why that's a gross simplification. All right. First, they're right about one thing, which is Biden has made drilling more expensive in America. They're right about that. He has some executive orders that did that. They're also right that I think the stats say that the Biden administration has leased fewer acres for oil and gas drilling offshore on federal land, and on federal land than any other administration since World War II. He's leased 120,000 acres. No other president since Harry Truman leased fewer than 4.5 million acres at this stage, right? So much, much less. But that stuff is going to come online later anyway. And the most important thing is it doesn't affect the price that much. The price of oil is set by the market, whether America's energy independent or not. And by the way, America is still actually oil independent. They're still net exporters rather than importers. So that's rubbish anyway. But even if America brought on heaps more oil, that would bring down the price of oil by a little bit because of demand and supply. But still, they can't ignore Saudi Arabia. Like the OPEC is an enormous amount of oil. So whatever America does is going to affect the price a little bit. Definitely will affect the price, but not so much will be back down to $2.50. So that's kind of a garbage argument. I just wanted to just make sure people realise that. Having said that, I also feel like Biden at some point in time needs to acknowledge that it's a trade-off. When you care about the environment, it's just a fact. Oil prices are going to be higher. Unless because if you're trying to go to green energy, you need to discourage people from using petrol. They need to use green energy.
But the market being the market, when the oil price then goes up, it creates greater incentive for oil producers to go and find more oil so they can sell it at a higher price.
But there's that as well. So anyway, it's a bit conflated. But I did want to just say that that there is a bit of confusion going on with the Biden administration, even though I feel like the oil side has been overblown by conservatives. I think they do make a good point that Biden is speaking out both sides of his mouth at the moment. Because on one hand, he's telling oil companies to drill more. He's actually explicitly going, drill more, invest more. But at the same time, he's saying, but in 5 years, we don't want you to drill at all. And this clip here from his energy secretary is just a perfect indication of the contradiction at play all at the same time.
5 years from now, 10 years from now, are you telling me you want them drilling for more oil? You want the refineries putting out more gasoline in 5 or 10 years?
what we're saying is today we need that supply increased. Of course, in 5 or 10 years, actually in the immediate, we are also pressing on the accelerator, if you will, to move toward clean energy so that we don't have to be under the thumb of petro-dictators like Putin or at the whim of the volatility of fossil fuels. Ultimately, America will be most secure when we can rely upon our own clean domestic production of energy.
But that's the
through
problem for
solar,
these companies.
through wind,
These
through
companies are saying, you know, you're asking me to do more now, invest more now, when in fact 5 or 10 years from now, we don't think that demand will be there, and the administration doesn't even necessarily want it to be there.
John, we really want to see us move to clean energy, but we also need to see this increase right now, and we are asking the oil and gas companies as well to diversify and make sure that that they become diversified energy companies to be able to produce other means of clean energy, because they have huge, deep pockets. They have a big ability to invest in the future as well as investing right now, so that we don't see oil and gas causing the inflation numbers and people being hurt every day.
So you can see that it is a very complicated issue.
Yep.
But obviously, complication doesn't help in elections, and the oil prices are high, and they might lose Nevada because of it.
Yeah, and it's not just about the midterms as well. Obviously, it is also about the fact that this is Saudi Arabia saying, we're doing a favour to Russia right now by increasing oil prices, and we're quite happy to be seen to be doing that, because Saudi Arabia is saying, look, if you call us a pariah too many times, we'll go and find a pariah of our own, Vladimir Putin.
And it's in their commercial interest.
Yeah.
Let's face it.
We did talk a little bit in the show about crime and crime data in the United States. A lot of categories of crime, including murder, increasing during the pandemic. Questions around the data itself, though. We spoke to a guy we've had on the show before, Jeff Asher, who's one of the leading crime statisticians.
Top guy.
Yeah, so you've been looking into this issue and the discrepancies. Set this up for us.
Yeah, okay. So basically, you have a situation where Republicans are saying that Democrats are soft on crime because of this huge spike in crime under Biden. Well, actually, the spike came in 2020 when Trump was president. They then blamed Black Lives Matter, and they said, oh, the weak Democratic mayors with their Democratic...
defunding the police.
Yeah, etc. Yeah, well, look, the evidence suggests that there is no difference between Democrats and Republicans when it comes to city by city. But the thing is that we just don't know what's happened for the last 2 years, because they've done this transfer of data systems from one data system to another, and they haven't quite fully implemented it properly. So the data from 2021 is sketchy-ish. The data from 2022 is super sketchy. We haven't finished 2022 yet. So basically, we're all arguing in the dark. The evidence that existed from 2020, there was a massive spike, which got people's attention to crime, but the evidence didn't indicate that it was Democrat or Republican. And since then, we don't know what's happened. So enter Jeff Asher, who really is the top guy when it comes to crime data. Everyone quotes him. And we asked him to get to the bottom of all these issues.
Jeff Asher, welcome back to Planet America. Good to see you again.
Good to be back.
So, Jeff, how confident are you that these official crime figures that we're seeing at the moment accurately reflect what is happening in America today?
Well, I'm confident that the confidence intervals that the FBI expressed are reasonably accurate, but they were kind of enormous confidence intervals, so enormous margins of error. It's a lot of uncertainty regarding where our crime figures went this year. I think the murder count, just because we're able to confirm it using big cities, is much more accurate, much more reliable than the sort of overall property and violent crime figures that the FBI produced yesterday.
So, Jeff, it seems like murder has dropped off a little bit so far this year. What are the latest results for other crimes?
So we have murder was up 4% according to the FBI last year. This year, we have 90-something cities of big cities of data that show murder down about 4.5%. So that we feel good that there's probably going to be a drop in murder after really a pair of historic years in terms of the 2-year rise relative to 2019. We really don't have any data on anything else. The FBI produces quarterly crime reports sort of 3 months after the fact, but they're very flawed. Something like 40 or 50% of the cities that are reporting in the quarterly data are reporting bad data to the FBI. And the FBI is not making national estimates out of it because they've set a threshold of 60% of agencies have to report for them to be able to do a national estimate, and they haven't hit that. So we really have no idea what's happening in 2022 in terms of most crime. We have some understanding of what's happening in terms of murder, but in terms of property crime, we've seen multiple decades straight of dropping property crime nationally. I would expect that to continue in 2022. Violent crime increased a lot in 2020 and 2021. It's probably about the same, but much more of a sort of a gut estimate than anything I'm normally comfortable with saying.
So obviously, Jeff, murder is a broad term. Murders don't tend to go underreported. You have a body ultimately. But does the data tell you what category of murder these are? Are these domestic incidents increasing recently? Are they drug related, or is there something else driving this increasing number?
Well, so we can clearly see that in 2020, there was a rise in murder starting in sort of the first couple of quarters of the year. So we can maybe say that some of the stresses of the pandemic led to somewhat of an increase in murder, less so violent crime, because the data is not as firmly reported as it is with murder. And then we saw a big increase starting in May 2020, right after the murder of George Floyd, that we sort of had this really big increase, and we maybe went up a little bit more in 2021 and are maybe coming down a little bit in 2022. But we've sort of plateaued at this level that is the highest that it's been nationally in terms of total murders since the mid 1990s, which is really the period that in America everybody talks about it as sort of the worst in terms of murder and murder rate. We're not quite there in terms of murder rate because obviously the country is much bigger than it was almost 3 decades ago. But in terms of raw numbers, we've reached really this really horrific and unfortunate period in our history in terms of murders.
Jeff, do you agree that in 2020 and 2021, Republican and rural places saw the same crime trends that urban and Democratic places saw, or do you think there is actually some kind of party political based pattern to crime?
We really haven't looked at 2021. That data just came out, and reporting was so hit or miss that I don't know that we'll ever be able to say what it looked like in 2021. In terms of 2020, there were maybe slight differences in the overall numbers, but the trend was the same. Murder was up in big cities, over 1 million people. It was up in cities of 10,000 or fewer people. It was up in suburbs. It was up in sort of rural counties. And it was definitely up in Biden counties, and it was up in Trump counties. So it really wasn't a political polarization issue. We tend to, I think of it as a political polarization issue because big cities are the places that produce the best data. It's easiest to track. We have a tracker of 90 plus cities where every week we're able to update the vast majority of cities, or every month at least, and say there were X number of murders that's up Y or down Y% relative to last year. Can't really do that with most places in America. There's 18,000 plus law enforcement agencies, and we're talking about being able to track murder in maybe 90 to 100 of them. And big cities tend to have Democratic mayors. They tend to have Democratic leadership. And so we're very much have that sort of survivorship bias where what we see is what we see because of that's where the data is available.
Some progressive district attorneys have been getting a lot of attention recently for trying to minimise prison times for minor crimes. In particular, that's been happening in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, which is relevant to the midterms. Have you seen any evidence in the data that those kinds of policies affect crime one way or another?
We haven't really. There was one paper that came out that was immediately provoked. It discussed in Philadelphia deprosecution, as the paper talked about it, and tried to tie it to an increase in homicides. But it seemed questionable, and I know that there's been academics are very much not uniformly interested in or not uniformly in agreement about whether or not the sort of math behind the paper actually works the way that the author says it is. That's, I think, the closest that anyone's come. I personally am skeptical of the role of prosecutors, just because we know that in all of our literature that the likelihood of getting swiftly caught is the thing that drives deterrence. And in a lot of cities like Philadelphia, New Orleans, where I am, Oakland, Atlanta, all of these big cities, we have 35% murder clearance rates year after year after year. And so you're talking about especially in communities that are sort of most affected by gun violence, they're the ones that get the smallest murder clearance rates. So we're not talking about an enormous amount of cases that are being affected by prosecution related to gun violence. And there's actually evidence, a couple of economists did research using data from Boston's progressive prosecutor that showed that refusing the first time misdemeanor charges led to significantly better outcomes. That people who had these charges refused were far less likely to be rearrested years down the line. And so I think that the evidence, and again, in our political circles in America, we don't do a good job of thinking about the evidence at all. I think that the evidence comes a little bit stronger in terms of it's good to refuse these types of charges. And I do consulting with the progressive prosecutor down in New Orleans. I'll acknowledge that. But it's not something that we have really, really strong evidence for at this point, I would say.
And Jeff, while we've got you there, I wonder, what is your reaction to the news this week that the Biden administration is pardoning those convicted of what they describe as simple cannabis or marijuana possession offences? Is that going to have much of an impact?
I think it's much more of a good talking point than something that will really dramatically influence people's lives. You're talking about, and again, I'm not entirely certain what the exact numbers are, but you're probably talking about a couple thousand people in a federal system that's got hundreds of thousands of people locked up. So probably a really small number of people affected, which doesn't mean it's not good policy. And it's, certainly we shouldn't, I certainly think that we shouldn't have people locked up solely because they got arrested for misdemeanor possession of marijuana. But I think that the number of people that actually fit that criteria is probably pretty small. We've already seen states doing it. We've already seen cities doing it. New Orleans, where I am, in late 2021, wiped out misdemeanor drug charges and the fines that came with it for 10,000 plus people that had those charges since 2010, and basically took steps to further decriminalize marijuana. And there have only been 7 people this year who have been arrested or received a summons solely for possession of marijuana, compared to in 2019, there were something like 2,000 plus people that were at least summoned and received a citation for possession of marijuana. So I don't know that it'll have a huge effect on what's happening at a local level. I think it's really trailing what's already happening at the local and the state level in a lot of places.
So Jeff, sum it all up for us, based on this most recent set of numbers. What is the big picture that you're seeing in America today? How would you sum it up?
Well, as a data analyst, my primary concern is that our data collection and reporting is completely demolished, that we've purposefully dismantled our ability to tell these things with precision. And it'll be years before we really know for sure what's going on. Thinking more broadly, I think that we've seen this dramatic uptick in murder in Louisiana, or excuse me, we've seen this dramatic uptick in America, New Orleans as well, and Louisiana as well. But that the things have sort of stabilized. They're not inherently getting worse, but we don't have a ton of really strong evidence-backed ideas that are being successfully implemented in places that have seen these dramatic increases, that things are going down and going down quickly. We've got, Chicago and New York and Los Angeles are all seeing not tiny, but not huge declines in gun violence and murders this year. But then there's a lot of places. New Orleans is going to have its highest murder rate since 1995. And a bunch of other places like Jackson, Mississippi, that are having just extraordinarily high murder rates relative to what they're used to. And so I think that it remains an intractable problem. It's something that we have not solved, and that we maybe have some ideas, but that we don't have necessarily a strong national blueprint for solving this issue.
Finally, I know the data's spotty for the latest figures, so you might not be able to answer the question, but are there any trends that we, the public, should be talking about when it comes to crime right now that we're not talking about?
I think that the role of firearms and the role of new guns that are being purchased, we have ATF data that's showing us that newly purchased guns are making their ways into crimes at a much higher share than ever before. We know that the share of firearms that are being used in murders has gone up from 60-something% 8 years ago to almost 80% now. And we know that there's been a corresponding drop in the share of murders that are being cleared and where arrests are being made. And that largely is reflective of it's harder to solve a gun murder than a knife murder or a bludgeoning or something like that. And so I think that we talk about firearms a lot, but we usually talk about them in response to big school shootings, these enormous tragedies that take the lives of, a dozen people at a time. Whereas the reality is that that's this tiny fraction of American gun violence. And we have this everyday fraction of gun violence where it's just day after day after day, one or two at a time. And if we're going to find solutions to the murder rate, then we need to be able to find solutions to sort of that everyday gun violence. Not to say that we shouldn't be focusing on mass shootings as an important issue that we need to find ways to reduce. But if our policies aren't addressing the driver, which is this everyday drip of gun violence, then we're going to be ineffective in solving them.
Jeff Asher, good to talk to you again. Thanks for being with us on Planet America.
Thanks for having me.
Well, that was Jeff Asher joining us from the Big Easy of New Orleans, and that is it for Off the Planet for this week, Chaz. But for those for whom that was not nearly enough, there's more.
Yes, there's a pet podcast. Me and Dr. Dave Smith, we talk American politics till you will not want more after that, I assure you. We talk and talk and talk and talk. So you can see that from any podcast place.
All right, we'll see you soon.